Vielen Dank. Actually, I asked Nicholas Rupke to help me by translating my first paragraph into German, but I'm not going to say it because everybody here has so much better English than my German. So thank you so much. Vielen Dank. Thank you for the warm welcome back to Göttingen. Double thanks to Nicholas Rupke, who was my host when I visited Göttingen in 2001 to start my work on the history of white people. So I also want to thank Wolfgang Böcke for invaluable research help and logistical help, because you know that Deutsche Bahn decided not to let me take a train from Berlin yesterday. But in addition, and right along the lines of our conference today, so much more material is available on what went into my book, available digitally now, that it actually changed what I said in my book, and you'll see how it changed what I want to say about the 5 skulls. So I'm absolutely delighted, das gefällt mir, to come back to such a charming city, such an intellectual city as Göttingen. And as Professor Rupke mentioned, I have pursued further education since retiring from Princeton. But I will add that I am going to teach a class back at Princeton this fall for the first time in 10 years. But it will be in art, not in history. So when I began the research that became my book, The History of White People, and if you want to have some interesting experiences in the United States, try being a black person with a book called The History of White People. So I was a regular historian, pretty conventional in the sense that I was attuned primarily to archives and primarily to text. But when I say pretty conventional, I mean I wasn't an art historian, but I was not a 100% conventional historian because of the questions I asked and the methods I used. I began working with images with a biography of the 19th century American abolitionist Sojourner Truth, and then I did a book called Creating Black Americans in the early years of this century, in which all the illustrations are fine art. So my turn toward the visual began before my education, my formal education in art. But even so, my attentiveness toward the illustrations in those books didn't fundamentally alter my concept of historical meaning. My fundamental test for historical meaning was representativeness. To what extent did the phenomena I was examining represent larger truths? To what extent were the people I was talking about important for other people and larger phenomena? But the major shift in my intention occurred during the 5 years I undertook my recent education in visual art. Between 2006 and 2011, I earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts and a Master of Fine Arts degrees, both in painting from Rutgers University and the Rhode Island School of Design. Now, in art, the meaning that counts is visual meaning. The test is not about representativeness. Representativeness does not matter in visual art. As an artist, as a painter, my attention came to focus ever more on singularity. When I was writing The History of White People, I noted where the skulls came from, but I focused on what Blumenbach and his followers made of them and what they came to stand for, representativeness. Now, as a painter, I'm interested in the individual people the skulls had belonged to and the particular circumstances of their inclusion in Blumenbach's Golgotha. Now I think of Professor Blumenbach's scientifically recognized methods of picking out 5 skulls from 5 individuals, and turning them into varieties of mankind. It would be as though I lost my head, and you boiled all the flesh off it, and sucked the brains out, and the eyeballs, and you called it New Jersey variety of mankind. I would stand for all 9 million people in New Jersey. My husband, Glenn, who lives in the same house with me, would not count. It would be my skull, not his, that personified New Jerseyans as a whole. You can see the imprint of my art education in my book, The History of White People. Since its publication, I have made art that implicated me even more deeply in the particular. As a painter, I must give you a lecture with lots of pictures in it. I'll be showing you art by me and by other artists. The historian's heart still beats in me, and it prompts my conclusions regarding sexual vulnerability, empire, and its prerequisite, warfare. Professor Schultz has given you an excellent and comprehensive account of Blumenbach's skull collections, and I'm very grateful to follow that. I am dealing only with the 5 skulls that became emblematic, the 5 skulls, or as we say today, the 5 races. I want to emphasize Blumenbach's arrangement according to aesthetic judgment, for beauty counted so heavily in his assignment of the nomenclature that has stuck to this day in the United States, Caucasian. Caucasian as a term with scientific connotations, standing for the more vernacular and much more common white people. As a reporter in the New York Times said, Caucasian is to white as vehicle is to car. Blumenbach arranged his skulls horizontally, not hierarchically, which is the pattern that the racist scholars following him preferred. The 2 skulls he placed at the ends he called the ugly ones, the Mongolian on the far left and the Ethiopian on the far right. His most beautiful skull, the Caucasian, was the skull he put in the middle. Between the Mongolian and the Caucasian was the skull he considered intermediary, the American, and between the Ethiopian and the Caucasian was another intermediary skull, the Malay. Now, I worked from Thomas Bindishy's 1865 English translation of Blumenbach's treatises. And in that book, and you see this fold-out accordion of the etchings of the skulls. When I wrote, I had not seen the photographs and the videos that we saw today. So first, the Mongolian skull. This was the first of the 2 ugly skulls. Skull came from Siberia, from Georg von Asch, and you have already been introduced to him. This is a man who has a name, Tishvin Amarov of Siberia. Russian colonization of Siberia took centuries and entailed war, settlement, and scientific encroachment on the native peoples. Von Asch may well have received the skull from friends, Johann Gehrig and Jan Gottlieb Gorgi in the Russian Academy, from the Russian Academy expeditions of 1768, 1774. You already know that Georg von Asch was a Russian medical doctor of German ancestry who had studied at Göttingen and who enriched its library and natural history collections over the course of decades. Von Asch served in the Russian Imperial Army of Catherine the Great, and with Catherine and Asch, empire went hand in hand in hand with scholarship. The Blumenbach collection names this skull as Tungus. However, the current designation of this people, Siberian people, is Evenks, or those in the eastern region call themselves Evens. And here is an image from Johann Gottlieb Georgi, Notes on a Voyage Through the Russian Empire, Siberian and Russian America. So the Evenks lived off wild and domesticated reindeer. They milked reindeer, they used reindeer as pack animals, they rode reindeer. In the 17th century, their population numbered about 36,000. And they spread over a very large territory. I've colored in yellow the area where Evenks lived. Between the rivers Ob and Yenisei in the west and Kamchatka in the east. Now, fomenting wars between the various Evenks clans was a Russian tactic for domination. So Sven Amoureux, who in death retains his name and his clan name, may have fallen victim to other Evenks or to Russians directly. The second of Blumenbach's ugly skulls was the Ethiopian. This skull came from Professor Stefan van Goens of the University in Utrecht. Blumenbach got this skull from Jan van Goens, who was professor of medicine, physiology, and botany at the University of Utrecht. And I'm grateful to Herr Burke for kindly sending me information on van Goens, who studied at Göttingen 1789 and 1790, and who knew Blumenbach personally. Van Goens took his medical degree in Jena in 1790, but he died of typhoid in 1795, 2 months before Blumenbach picked up this quote-unquote Ethiopian skull in Amsterdam. Blumenbach described this skull as coming from Guinea, that is, from the Bight of Benin in West Africa, and it's having belonged to the concubine of a Dutchman. This woman would have come from the Dutch slaving settlement of Elmina in what is now the Republic of Ghana. The Dutch West India Company seized Elmina Castle from the Portuguese in 1621, but slaving trading depended upon agreements between Europeans and the local people who controlled supply from the hinterland. By 1701, these were the Ashanti. Now, when I think about slave trading and I talk about slave trading, I always stress that its history belongs to the history of business. In the United States, where we think of slavery and slave trading as relating to Africa and the Atlantic Ocean, Americans are very quick to think of slave trading as uniquely African and Atlantic and uniquely racial. As you in Europe know, that is not the case, and that European institutions as well, European institutions and nations, as well as African suppliers, were involved in business, commercial arrangements for selling people. And this kind of arrangement existed in the Black Sea, existed in Asia, now exist in South America. With an 18th century population of between 12,000 and 16,000, of whom fewer than 400 were European, Elmina was the largest settlement on the Gold Coast, a sort of New York City, as it were, attracting ambitious Africans from all throughout the regions. So this image shows you Elmina Castle, which was the actual site of the trade, but also the village and you could call it the town that was around it supplying all kinds of services that a large commercial establishment required. So the woman whose skull we saw would have come from that settlement. Many liaisons and many children we might call mixed race, resulted, and Dutchmen returning to the Netherlands either had to take their children back to Europe with them or pay for their schooling. There was not provision for wives, and I'm calling the woman whose skull we see as a wife because the Dutchman, who has no name, kept her by his side from Elmina to Amsterdam. She died in Amsterdam when she was 26. So concubine sounds more casual than someone to be kept at one side across the continents. And here, what is this? She died in Amsterdam at 26, most likely given the condition of her teeth after having children. Whether wife or concubine, sexual intimacy attached her to the man who took her to Amsterdam. Ultimately, this unnamed woman lost her life in Amsterdam and her head to Professor von Gunz. Blumenbach designated two intermediary skulls, the American and the Malay. First, the Malay. This skull came to Blumenbach from Joseph Banks, and Blumenbach corresponded with Banks in several languages and over the course of years trying to get a skull out of Banks, and Banks kept explaining that it was hard to get people to part with their heads. But this skull Blumenbach got out of the foremost English naturalist of the late 18th century, Sir Joseph Banks, by dint of several pleading letters in different languages. A wealthy scientific prodigy, Banks was made a Fellow of the Royal Society at age 23. He served as Royal Society President from 1778 until his death in 1820. In my collage, the best-known South Sea Islander, Omai, stands with his patron, Joseph Banks, and sitting Daniel Solander, and they are in front of the armed Fort Venus in Tahiti, and down below you have a Tahitian boat. Omai was from Raitan, the next large island in the Society Islands north of Tahiti. He was the second political islander to visit Europe after Ahutoru, who Bougainville had brought to Paris in 1768. Omai spent 2 years in London as the guest of Joseph Banks. He did not leave his head. He returned to the Pacific, and he died there at age 26. Daniel Solander was a Swedish naturalist and doctor who accompanied Banks on Captain James Cook's first great voyage of 1768-1771. As those of you in the conference have already heard, Banks went with Cook to observe the transit of Venus in the South Seas. The transit of Venus is when Venus crosses between the Earth and the Sun, and this was important to scientists around the world, including Russia, but it was especially important for the British because it was helpful for navigational purposes, for calculating longitude. So for this purpose, Banks and Cooks erected Fort Venus, which you see in the back there, which mounted guns on its turrets against people like the former owner of the skull that joined Blumenbach's collection. The fortifications protected against people living like this. This is a scene in Tahiti from Captain James Cook's first great voyage. This scene looks peaceful, but the local people were not necessarily welcoming, as Captain Cook was warned. He was warned that Captain Wallace, who had the first Westerner to encounter Tahiti, as Captain Wallace has represented the island to be very populous and the natives to be rather treacherous than otherwise, you are to be cautious not to let yourself be surprised by them, but constantly be on your guard against any accident. While attending to the transit of Venus, Banks and Cook encountered breadfruit in Tahiti and figured it as a cheap source of food for sugar workers in the West Indies. And here is James Cook with breadfruit. Banks offered a cash reward and a gold medal to whomever could transplant breadfruit to the Caribbean. The result was the British naval expedition of 1787 of William Bligh, the captain of HMS Bounty. And here is Bligh and a team digging up breadfruit in Tahiti. I have not messed with this one. After 5 months of digging up breadfruit, Bligh's men mutinied. Some said it was because they didn't want to leave their girlfriends. Bligh's men mutiny, which is known as the Mutiny of the Bounty, but a second expedition succeeded in bringing breadfruit to the Caribbean to St. Vincent's Botanic Garden, one of the oldest botanical gardens in the Western world and the oldest in the tropics. Blumenbach's American skull came via the director of the St. Vincent Botanic Garden. The American skull of a Carib chief of St. Vincent in the West Indies, also sent from Joseph Banks. Robert Melville, a founder of the St. Vincent Botanic Garden, most likely had this skull dug up and sent to Blumenbach. Melville was elected a fellow of Banks's Royal Society in 1775. European diseases and warfare decimated the Caribs, the native people of St. Vincent, as Europeans planted tobacco and sugar and transplanted workers first from Britain and then from Africa. My image shows a Carib family vanishing in the face of vast sugar planting. For Blumenbach, the Malay and the American were both in between in terms of beauty and skull shape. We can add that Joseph Banks and breadfruit in the quest for cheap foodstuffs also linked them together through American sugar plantations and New World slavery. We will soon return to slavery, but in the Old World. Over the passage of nearly 2 centuries, Blumenbach's intermediate categories of humanity have fallen by the wayside, leaving in the orthodoxy announced by anthropologists in the mid-20th century only 3 real races: the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, and the Negroid, in that order of preference, perhaps, if the anthropologist had been pressed, also in beauty. I have already mentioned the Mongoloid and the Negroid. Well, that's 20th century talk. You know, you have the oid at the end to show its science. So we've already mentioned the Mongoloid and the Negroid skulls, but what of the Caucasoid? Blumenbach's Caucasian skull, in his words, as rendered in the 19th century English translation of a book Blumenbach had composed in 18th century Latin as written in Germany, says, and Blumenbach says, The really most beautiful form of skull, which my beautiful typical head of a young Georgian female always of itself attracts every eye, however little observant. This skull came from Van Asch, who, as you know, belonged to a wide network of scholarly colleagues, as well as serving Catherine the Great during her wars of imperial Russian expansion, in this case, south into the Caucasus. That's the one you squared up. We have a little controversy going on here. This is the squared up image of my image, which is long and narrow, but this one fits better with the others, even though it's not the one I made. So Catherine expands into the Caucasus. The Georgian Caucasian skull came to Göttingen from Van Asch via a medical colleague in Moscow, where the woman's body had been autopsied and the head separated from the body. This is the head, and this image comes from the earlier engravings. The young Georgian female captive. Van Asch's cover letter indicated that the young woman had died of venereal disease. A captive of war, a sex slave, the young Georgian woman was raped to death in Russia. Let me repeat. The young woman whose skull gave the name Caucasian to American white people was a sex slave who had been raped to death. The young Georgian woman's death through sex and Blumenbach's linking of Caucasian with beauty belongs to an older usage than the Enlightenment. This usage has two dimensions. One is its association of ethnicity with female beauty. The other is the interchangeable naming of Caucasians, Georgians, and Circassians, or Circassians, both are used. And these interchangeable people as the most beautiful people, that is, the women, the most beautiful people in the world. The slippage in naming echoes Blumenbach's elision of Georgian and Caucasian. One of the earliest Europeans to attempt to categorize people by body type was François Bernier, a French physician and traveler, the personal physician of the Mughal Emperor of India for 12 years. In my image, Bernier sits by a bush under a cameo of his more illustrious compatriot, Jean Chardin. Bernier's 1684 publication, Nouvelle division de la Terre par les différentes espèces ou races qui l'habitent, is considered the first published post-classical classification of humans into distinct types. In Nouvelle division de la Terre, he had referred to the beauty of Circassian slave women as already assumed by all the travelers. Jean Chardin, Journal du voyage du chevalier Chardin en Perse et aux Indes orientales, etc., 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 1689. Another illustrious French traveler, Chardin was a Huguenot jewelry merchant and savant. It was Chardin's description of beautiful Georgians that Blumenbach quoted. The blood of Georgia is the most beautiful in the Orient, and I would have to say in the world, for I have never noticed an ugly face of either sex in this country, and some are downright angelic. Nature has endowed most of the women with graces not to be seen in any other place. I have to say, it is impossible to look at them without falling in love with them. Now, this kind of description is the most famous associated with Chardin, probably because of Blumenbach. But Chardin wrote a lot more about the people of the Caucasus. He was going through the Caucasus. And interestingly enough, what I just read you has been translated into English. The larger discussion of the people of the Caucasus has not been translated. Luckily, I can read French, and I found it. And there Chardin says, these blankety-blank people are a bunch of brigands. They will sell their mother, they will sell their sister, they sell their children, plus they smell bad, and the women wear too much makeup. At any rate, this is how we get Chardin translating the idea of Circassian, Georgian, Caucasian beauty. And here are some of Chardin's words, along with some present-day Georgians and the 20th century's most famous Georgian, Joseph Stalin, who was, you have to admit, rather good-looking. Chardin's view was commonplace by the time Blumenbach wrote in the 18th century. For instance, the world's most illustrious philosopher, a man who evidently had a very small brain, the world's most illustrious philosopher, Immanuel Kant, agreed in 1763 with Chardin and Blumenbach about the beauty of Circassian and Georgian maidens. They had always been considered extremely pretty by all Europeans who traveled through their lands. And then Kant added that the Turks and the Arabs and the Persians considered them very good looking, and they buy them to put in their harems in order to beautify the Turks and the Persians and the Arabs. And the two parts of this kind of march through history. The idea that the Circassians, Georgians, and Caucasians are uniquely beautiful, and that they go into harems, whether it's Turks or Persians, they go into harems to beautify the Turks and Persians. Kant's younger East Prussian colleague, the philosopher Jan Herder, reinforced the connection of servitude, beauty, and the Black Sea Caspian region as a center of beautiful forms. And like Kant, Herder echoed Chardin, changing Chardin's Persians into Turks. Herder says the Turks, originally a hideous race, improved their appearance and rendered themselves more agreeable when handsomer nations became servants to them. In the English-speaking world, Edward Daniel Clarke made his career as a tutor in Cambridge University. He was a member of the Academy of Sciences at Berlin, the Cambridge Philosophical Society, and other learned societies of the prevailing scholarly network. Clarke's travels in various countries of Europe, Asia, and Africa was first published in 1810, went through countless editions in Britain and America, and supplied eyewitness testimony of the beauty of Caucasians and Circassians. Here is Edward Daniel Clarke. Their women are the most beautiful, perhaps, in the world. Once again, the notion of Caucasian beauty appears as established in Clarke's work. Beauty of feature and of form, for which the Circassians have so long been celebrated, is certainly prevalent among them. Their noses are aquiline, their eyebrows arched and regular, their mouths small, and their teeth remarkably white. Once again, Circassian beauty resides in the enslaved. Their women are perhaps the most beautiful in the world, of enchanting perfection of features and very delicate complexions. The females that we saw, all of them, were accidental captives of war who had been carried off with their families. They were, however, remarkably handsome. The sources from Chardin to Clarke and beyond always associate the idea of surpassing beauty with captivity and slavery. For this reason, beauty, science, and slavery merit their own chapters in my book, The History of White People. They are important but under-theorized themes in the history of science. The historical roots of the Black Sea slave trade stretch back before the 5th century BC, when the pioneering Greek historian Herodotus mentioned it. In an enumeration of taxes and tribute the Persian kingdom collected from the lands it controlled, Herodotus mentions the tribute from the distant Caucasus. This is Herodotus. A voluntary contribution was undertaken by the Caucasians, another name for Georgians, and the neighboring tribes between them and the Caucasus. The limit of the Persian Empire in this direction, everything to the northward being outside the range of Persian influence. In their case, the contribution consisted, and still does, in the gift every 4th year of 100 boys and 100 girls. I should add that Herodotus also mentions tribute owed to Persia from the distant peoples of the southwest, the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians owed gold and ivory, no mention of people. The Black Sea slave trade was the Western slave trade until the 15th century, when the Ottoman capture of Constantinople cut the Black Sea off from Western Europe. At that point, the Atlantic slave trade became the Western slave trade, first in the service of tobacco, and then in sugar, and then in cotton. Jean Chardin was traveling on the Black Sea when he described the beautiful slave woman in the passage that Blumenbach quoted. The woman was 25 years old with a smooth, even lily-white complexion and admirably beautiful features. I have never before seen such beautifully rounded breasts. That woman inspired overall sensations of desire and compassion. That woman was in a boat full of slaves. So Chardin was on a boat, which included a Greek merchant, and the Black Sea slave trade was controlled by Greek merchants. And so Chardin listed the prevailing price list. The price was erotic. Pretty girls, aged 13 to 18, 20 écus. Plainer girls for less. Women went for 12 écus. Children for 3 or 4 écus. Men aged 25 to 40, 15 écus. Those older, only 8 to 12 écus. The Greek merchant, whose room on the boat was near Chardin's, bought the woman and her baby at the breast for 12 écus. For some 120 years later, Edward Daniel Clark also mentioned the Black Sea slave trade and gave relevant prices. Clark says, the Circassians frequently sell their children to strangers, particularly to the Russians, the Persians, and Turks. The most beautiful prisoners of both sexes are sold for high prices for the harem. A Circassian female, 14 years of age, conscious of her great beauty, feared her parents would sell her according to the custom of the country. The women were selling generally for from 25 to 30 rubles apiece, somewhat less than the price of a horse. By the 19th century, the figure of the beautiful young slave girl from the Caucasus had acquired a name from the Turkish and the French, odalisque. The odalisque combines the powerful notions of beauty, sex, and slavery. In European and American art of the 19th century particularly, she looks like the white girl next door, but she's a slave, so you can do with her as you will. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres began his career in Italy, a country rife with Eastern influences. His odalisques are epitomes of luxe et volupté. They lounge languidly amongst the splendor of the Turkish harem. The odalisque is always so white-skinned she could be taken for French. So the result is a kind of soft pornography, a naked young woman fair game for art voyeurs. Note the Grand Odalisque. This is one of Ingres' early paintings, 1814, painted in Rome. Jean-Léon Gérôme was a widely successful painter of Orientalist themes, professor at the École des Beaux-Arts, painted several large themes depicting harems and white slavery. This one is entitled The Slave Market. Here, the buyer and his agents examine the teeth of an undressed young woman for purchase. So, let's see, do I have? No. Ingres, Gérôme, Hiram Powers, the American, and well down into the 20th century, Pierre Matisse, specialized in odalisque paintings, and I have combined several of them here for you. The figure of the odalisque faded from memory as the Black Sea slave trade ended in the late 19th century, and the Atlantic slave trade overshadowed that from the Black Sea. Today, the word slavery, even though it comes from the word Slav, today the word slavery invariably leads to people of African descent. Americans seldom associate the word odalisque with slavery in the Americas, but in North and South American history, a similar figure appears in literature in the guise of the beautiful quadroon, most famously as Eliza in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is Eliza escaping with her son over the frozen river, this cover of a sheet music. In American visual art, the most popular piece of 19th century sculpture was the larger-than-life and sculpted from white marble, the Greek slave. This depicts a young white woman wearing only chains across her wrists. And you see how large she is, and she toured around, and you could just stand there and gape at her, and you were appreciating art. The title makes the young woman Greek, not Georgian, Circassian, or Caucasian, and a cross within the drapery makes her Christian rather than Muslim. But even so, the Greek slave demonstrates Orientalist whiteness in its material, and the Italian white marble, so critical to notions of Greek beauty. Only a few American abolitionists drew connections between Powers' white slave and the white-skinned slaves of the American South, where beauty, nor whiteness, nor youth could deliver a person of African ancestry from bondage. But history does not shackle the artist. During a residence in the Yaddo Artist Colony, I painted a series of maps I called Black Sea composite maps, juxtaposing territories where slave girls come from across the millennia. Not only the Black Sea, but Africa, Thailand, which is very much implicated in the slave trades today, and New Orleans, all together around a composite Black Sea. Let me close by reminding you that Johann Friedrich Blumenbach's 5 skulls came from real people who entered science through sex and war. His choices of names stemmed from scholarly prestige, collegial networks, and the vulnerability of local peoples to European power. One name, Caucasian, came from traditions about sexual vulnerability and beauty rooted in an ancient form of human subjugation, slavery. Thank you.